Good afternoon, good morning, afternoon, almost afternoon. My name is Dr. Imeh, and I'm a professor of art and art history at Westfield State University in Massachusetts, for some reason speaking to a group of scientists. And I'm so honored to be here, and thank you so much, Dr. Crystal, for this wonderful opportunity and this amazing introduction that has made me more emotional than I expected to be. It's a big project, bigger than I anticipated at the very beginning, because it means so much more to me now than it did at the start. And I should set the scene before going into the 6 works and my process. At the time that Dr. Crystal and Dr. Addy are having conversations with me, you have to understand that the world has just been like set on fire. Like right after COVID, we've just watched a 9-minute video of a Black man being killed. Whatever political, wherever you stand, somebody died in a horrific way, right? And there are protests, and there's a political energy in the atmosphere as well. And in that space, I was in my studio working on a set of projects that involved large angelic figures that were bound to the skins of Black boys and men to serve as witnesses to what Black people here were facing, were feeling at the time. Because all I had at that time were prayers. It was a very devastating time. And so building trust was a very big deal for me. And so to hear how this was for you means a lot to me. At that time, as a product of Yale University, PhD work in the art history department, as a product of Columbia University in the art history department, I have been in majority white institutions as the lone or one of very few Black people excelling there. So I know what it feels like to not see your face and to still have to strive. And so these works come out of that space. And I want to begin that conversation by just kind of introducing you to the project materials. And these are, on a surface level, are just materials, right? But I wanted you to understand where I start, because I think that they have a larger place in the meanings of the work. And also, you don't speak to a group of scientists without showing, this kind. I'm feeling like this is a more science. Look, I'm trying here. Look, I was almost a cognitive neuroscience major because I fell in love with it so much, but now I only have like random words. I don't know what Wernicke's area is, but I know it still. I have no reason to know what a hippocampus is, but I know, look, these things enter my work still in strange ways. Phineas Gage's story is interesting to me, right, on a larger level. But I tried to set this up scientifically, okay? I work on unstretched canvas for these works. There's 6 of them. They're almost 7 feet tall, so you get a sense of the gravity of the works. They're not small. India ink and acrylic ink. These are materials where I use water on the ground with the canvases to wash color onto the works, sometimes onto the blank canvas, sometimes on top of the works as a destructive but additive layer to the project I'm developing. Something that you can't control very well, water, is a big part of the works. Oil paint on some of the works. Charcoal and graphite on most of the works as a final layer of strength. My greatest strength is with drawing, and so charcoal and graphite are big components of the work. But there's something about the everyday nature of them. Children play with charcoal. We rolled around in dust as children, right? Everybody has a pencil, graphite. And so there's a way that these are every man's tools for everyday life. And I like the simplicity of those tools to tell complex stories. How do you go forward? Oh, that's how. So here's some of the works, all of the works. I won't talk about all of them specifically because we don't have that kind of time. The Memory Tower is one where I introduce self-portraiture into the work to have a conversation about memory collapse, disintegration. The circadian time signature brings together ideas of sleep, sleeplessness, sleep disruption, but I'm also thinking about time and timekeeping in a musical manner. The final portrait in circadian time signature, which I'll talk about more later, shows up at the very end of the work. I had no idea she was going to show up. She showed up, and now she's there, and she's actually the prominent figure. So there's a way that these works told me what they were going to be, as opposed to my own planning. Synaptic Apocalypse, Heir Apparent. The passing down of both the beauty and the traumas from one generation to the next. And we'll talk more about that work soon. We Are the Noise. The model for this work has a very large family. And they recently moved into a neighborhood. They're like the only black people in the neighborhood. And I said, how's the new neighborhood? He's like, well, we are the noise. And I was like, what does that mean? And he's like, oh, no, it's a beautiful thing. They know we're here because we make all the, but it's sounds of children laughing and playing and so on and so forth. And he's someone I know personally, this model, but him as a praying man meant a lot to me for this series. And his words became the title of the work. Tears of Icarus. I may have some time to talk more about this piece later. That is an introduction to the 6 works. At the beginning, look, I'm using certain words that have scientific meanings. I promise you they are not scientific meanings here, okay? So bioformulations, whatever Google tells you, whatever you know them to be, I am using these words to describe these forms that have shown up in my works for years. They are abstract forms, but I don't consider myself an abstract artist. So I don't like saying I use abstract forms. I don't believe they're abstract at all. I think that they are the elements of things that are alive. That's how I feel about these forms that I make. And they show up in a lot of my works. At the time that I was creating, right before I started working on the biological psychiatry cover images, I had entered a space of creation where I was only working on these bioforms, as I call them. And they do become architectures that figures can live in, and they do become or are prayers that I'm creating as I'm working on these pieces. They have more than just linear properties. And so I don't know what else to call them. So I've turned to science. Here's an example of one of them. This is a foundational bioformation of the piece that will become Heir Apparent, my favorite work in the series of 6. And this work was so strong in my studio. I'm giving you an example of what it looks like here next to me as I'm working, so you get a sense of the scale of the works. It was such a strong work at the time that I was thinking about submitting this as the journal cover itself, without any figuration in the work. Later on, figures decided to appear, and I went along with it, and it made sense as a completed work. But here's how the figures found their ways into the work. It's really a matriarchal theme in this work here. The love and the care and the grace of a mother passing down her information to this next generation, maybe a child. But I was interested in what gets passed down as not just things you learn, like everyday things you learn, but also generational things, whether those are generational joys or generational traumas. I was interested in having a larger conversation that connects my community, my communities, my Black communities, right? I'm Nigerian American. There's so many different kinds of Black people. I wanted to connect our community to this conversation of science and to this conversation of faith, which is such a big part of our communities. Is it enough to speak about a psychiatric disorder or problem without also dealing with the very, very, very real remedy of prayer and faith that is such a big part of our communities? I don't think it is. And so the reason why these works are so connected to the images I was creating, during the pandemic, those faith images, those prayers, those angelic beings, is because I don't know how you talk about remedy or even disorders in the absence of faith. And these works are that for me. My strong suit is figuration in works, portraiture, hands and bodies that are moving. And so the bringing together of these bioforms, these abstracted forms, with these more solid forms is what makes the series look like what it looks. These are charcoal renderings. Charcoal plays a very important role in the works, and maybe during conversation we can talk about that, so I don't have to overstate it here. This is just an example of how the bioform then fuses with the solid forms, and then with color. So there's a lot of taking the images off the wall and putting them on the ground. It is noteworthy that I can't do it by myself. I can't remove these canvases off the wall by myself. It takes 2 or 3 people, sometimes really good friends, sometimes hired studio assistants to help me do this, and then tacking and stapling and unstapling and unanchoring and then repositioning. And so there is a kind of, there's a human work that goes into making these things that feels like you're carrying around a real body. And so in that way, I never feel disconnected from the very subjects that are in the works as I'm making them, if that makes any sense. Doubles, layers, and destruction. This is a big part of my process. For some strange reason, the creating and the doubling and the layering and then sometimes the destroying of really, really great pieces to complete a work. I call it destroying. I'll show you an example very soon. On the left, there's this study for what will later become the work called Tears for Icarus. And on the right is one of these bioforms that is the foundational rendering for Tears of Icarus. That drawing on the left begins during the pandemic, because the pandemic for many Black folks in the United States was not just a time when a microbe was wiping us out, right? It was a time when everybody was kind of glued to their screens and watching the next Black person get executed, like, for whatever. Like, that's the reality. And so for us, it was a strange window of time where we're watching death happen on 2 fronts, but we're watching the world watch what we're seeing, what we've been saying. And so that work on the left is extremely important as a image that comes before the biological psychiatry works. But it shows up, it winds up as a main feature in these works. I didn't know that was going to happen, right? And it stayed that way. The image that you're seeing right now on the left stayed that way for some months. I thought that was going to be the image I was going to submit. And then the weeping Icarus figure, this Black boy, right, winged, but unable to fly at this time, weeping into his hands in one instance and catching his tears like a waterfall in the other instance, shows up. I had no control over this. There was no image source I was looking at. He happened. And so there's this human thing that keeps happening with the works where my emotions take over the process of creating, right? And artists, a lot of what we do is actually quite scientific. You have to be a scientist to put together these layers and to not have your images fall away in the wrong way. But a lot of people have this idea that what we do is purely emotional. I promise you it is not. It's just work. It's a lot of work. Hey, you're going to the studio? That must be fun. It is not fun. It is work. It's work. Can I come see you at the studio? No. And so when these emotional moments happen, they're real. They're real. I had a moment. I was overwhelmed. And I wept as I was drawing Icarus. I won't spend too much time on this for the sake of time for us to have a conversation, but this is part of that destruction thing. Just know that the image on the right is where the image was going to be, this sleeping figure, right? And then I went into the studio and it's like, actually, no, there's more. I picked up the white charcoal, again, charcoal, and this happened. And it made so much more sense. The image on the left is the completed work. So there's this way that the risk of damaging or even destroying the layer underneath is part of this great reward system you get, with the final works for me. I'm sure there's a lot of science that is like that as well. And finally, the last two slides, and I'm going to hold myself together to speak about this. It has everything to do, Dr. Crystal and Dr. Addy, with why this project is happening. First, I'll just speak to the gestures that you're seeing. Let me just remind you of something you're seeing here. You see that hand on the left image, that hand that's coming up to the chest of the final image? It's a small hand. It's the last thing I added to this image, and that's when I knew it was finished. There's this way that hands and gestures and the heart and the chest become a part of the conversation in this series of reminding us that we're dealing with human beings, which I think is really what you meant to do, Dr. Crystal, right? It's like, yeah, we're centering Black people. No, we're all humans here. Let's have a conversation. And so these works began to speak to each other. In these particular works here, they began to echo that sentiment. The work on the left with this prayer, right? We're talking about apocalypse. We're talking about a figure being overcome with color and other things that represent the erasure of the identity of this young man, who I happen to know, this model, his erasure because of all of the psychological things he's dealing with. But there's this prayer, there's this acknowledgement of faith. And also in another image here, not Tears of Icarus, I have the wrong one there. It's Heir Apparent. This same gesture is mirrored. Also here, the hand is holding a flower. This reminder, again, of the human quality in all of this. And finally, the last two images, and the final thing I'll say is Dr. Crystal, you set out to have us use these images as a way to have a conversation about centering Black stories, right? Centering Black and brown stories. I know your heart is bigger than that. It's bigger. You're really thinking like there's got to be a way we rethink all of this. But let's start here. Let's start with Black stories. You don't have to say it. I know. And I have to tell you, as I worked on this project, and by the end, when I saw everything, it was about the human condition. That's all it was. It was about recognizing that we all need to be recognized. It's about embracing our frailties, right? We're literally falling apart as we get older, and there's something horrifying about that, but there's something beautiful about that too. Everything decays. These canvases won't be here forever. But somehow, having a conversation about why these bodies matter now and remembering that we're human is a big part of this. And I just want to thank you so much for opening up my heart to this possibility, because I've grown because of it. Thank you. That's it.